In the early darkness above Memphis, the Mississippi was swollen, silent, and lined with black trees that blurred into the riverbank. A steamboat moved north through the current, crowded with Union soldiers who had survived prison camps and believed the war was finally behind them. On its decks, men slept shoulder to shoulder, while below them, repaired boilers carried pressure no one on the water could see. You enter the story through that final passage. The overloaded decks, the photograph taken before disaster, the rushed decisions at Vicksburg, and the evidence left behind after fire, steam, and river water erased so many lives. What happened aboard the Sultana was not only an explosion in the night, but a chain of warnings that kept being ignored. The river that was supposed to bring them home. In the last days of the Civil War, the Mississippi River looked less like a place of danger than a route back into ordinary life. A long brown road moving north through towns, military posts, flooded banks, and exhausted country. For thousands of men who had spent months behind prison walls, the river promised movement after confinement, distance after captivity, and the first real sign that the war might finally release its grip on them. It carried supply boats, military transports, cotton steamers, rumours, newspapers, and wounded soldiers, all moving through a nation that had won peace before it had learned how to absorb it. From the banks, a steamboat could appear almost comforting, with its tall stacks, crowded decks, and steady paddle wheels turning through the current. But in April of 1865, one journey north would reveal how thin the line could be between rescue and disaster. The war was ending in pieces, not in a single clean moment. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, and across the former battle lines, men who had spent years fighting began to understand that the immense machinery of war was slowing down. Yet surrender did not instantly empty the camps, clear the hospitals, open the roads, or return prisoners to their families. The country was still full of men waiting to be moved, counted, paroled, exchanged, buried, or sent home. Rail lines were damaged, command systems were strained, telegraph messages carried news faster than the army could carry bodies. The end of the fighting did not mean the end of danger, it only changed where that danger waited. For Union soldiers held in Confederate prison camps, freedom arrived in a form that was almost difficult to recognize. Many had been confined at Andersonville in Georgia or Cahaba in Alabama, names that had already become associated with hunger, disease, overcrowding, exposure, and slow physical collapse. Some prisoners had watched the war from behind fences while their bodies weakened under conditions that left permanent marks. They had survived not only battle, but months of deprivation after battle, and when release finally came, it did not arrive with comfort, privacy, or rest. It came through military procedures, parole lists, guarded movements, and the uncertain promise that if they could reach the right place, a transport would take them north. Their destination became Vicksburg, Mississippi, a city already heavy with the memory of war. The bluffs above the river had once been fought over with enormous force, and now those same heights looked down on another kind of military movement, quieter but no less human in its suffering. Former prisoners were brought there from the south to await transportation, and the river below the city became the next threshold between captivity and home. Men who had once marched under flags now moved in weakened groups toward a system that treated them less like individuals than numbers to be transferred. They were no longer enemy captives, but they were not yet restored citizens either. They existed in the uneasy space between survival and return. Along the Mississippi, steamboats had always seemed to possess a strange confidence. They pushed through bends and fog, past sandbars and wreckage, carrying passengers, cargo, soldiers, livestock, mail, and news through a river system that connected distant pieces of the country. In the spring of 1865, that confidence mattered because the nation needed movement. Former prisoners had to be taken north, units had to be discharged, supplies had to be redirected. The machinery of war had to reverse itself and bring men back from the places it had sent them. A boat heading upriver could seem like proof that order was returning, even when nearly everything about the country remained unstable. The men waiting near Vicksburg were not simply passengers choosing a route. Many had little money, little strength, and little ability to object to the arrangements made over them. Their families were somewhere beyond the river system, beyond the military paperwork, beyond the docks and loading orders. For some, home meant Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Tennessee, or other states whose names must have sounded almost unreal after prison life. The journey north was supposed to be the final passage through hardship, the last official movement before they could step away from the army and back toward kitchens, farms, workshops, churches, and relatives who did not yet know exactly what captivity had done to them. National attention, meanwhile, had been pulled into shock. President Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14th and died the next morning, only days after Lee's surrender. The country that had been preparing to celebrate the war's end entered mourning before it could fully understand victory. Newspapers filled with the assassination, the hunt for conspirators, the funeral journey, and the uncertain future of Reconstruction. In that atmosphere, the movements of thousands of former prisoners along the Mississippi were part of a much larger national confusion. Their story was urgent to the men living it, but the country around them was already overwhelmed by grief, revenge, exhaustion, and political fear. Still, for the prisoners themselves, the river must have carried a different meaning. It was not an abstract route on a military map. It was the thing between them and the north. Every steamboat whistle, every gangplank, every order shouted near the docks could seem like the beginning of a life returned. After months of being confined, counted, reduced, and watched, even an overcrowded landing could feel like motion. The river did not need to be beautiful to feel merciful. It only needed to move in the right direction. That hope made the coming disaster more disturbing, because the men were not travelling toward adventure, battle, or some unknown expedition. They were travelling away from war. They had already endured the part of the story that should have killed them. They had survived imprisonment, starvation, disease, and the collapse of the Confederacy around them. Their families had reason to believe the worst danger was behind them, because the fighting was ending and the prisoners were being released. The great cruelty of the Sultana story begins here, before the explosion, before the dark water, before the bodies, in the belief that the river journey was a rescue instead of the next threat. Military transport in that moment depended on urgency, availability, and the pressure to move large numbers of men quickly. Boats were not symbols of comfort. They were solutions to a logistical burden. The former prisoners gathered at Vicksburg had to be sent north, and the Mississippi offered the most direct path. Officials, boat captains, quartermasters, and military authorities all operated inside a system where speed and numbers could begin to matter more than caution. On paper, moving men by steamboat was practical. In reality, the men waiting to board had already become the kind of passengers least able to survive another emergency. The river did not announce that danger. It kept moving with the same current that had carried armies, gunboats, refugees, cotton, and wreckage through 4 years of war. Along its banks, the country looked battered but alive, and the promise of return seemed close enough to believe. For the released prisoners, the hardest chapters of captivity appeared to be behind them, while the boat that would carry them north seemed like the final instrument of deliverance. That was the terrible illusion at the centre of the journey. The same river that seemed to be taking them home was quietly carrying them toward the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. By the time a place was found for them on the waiting steamboat, many had already been reduced to bodies that could barely choose where they were being carried, men too weak to refuse the boat. Those bodies reached the landing not as ordinary travellers, but as survivors who had been carried forward by orders, habit, and the fragile belief that every step north meant they were closer to home. They were men released from captivity, yet release had not restored them. It had only moved them from one place of waiting to another, from prison camps to roads, from roads to staging points, from staging points toward the Mississippi. By the time they came near the steamboats at Vicksburg, many were already past the point where danger could be measured clearly. A crowded deck, a delayed departure, a hurried command, or a questionable arrangement might have troubled a healthy man, but these men had spent too long surviving conditions that made ordinary judgment feel like a luxury. Captivity had left its evidence on them before any official list could record their names, because prison life had reduced many men to hunger, sickness, weakness, and a kind of obedience born from exhaustion. They had not been resting behind the lines while the war ended elsewhere. They had been confined in places where food was limited, sanitation broke down, disease spread quickly, and the body had to spend itself simply staying alive. When freedom finally arrived, it did not erase the months that came before it. A man could be paroled, counted, released, and placed on a transport list, but his legs still carried the memory of starvation, his lungs and stomach still carried illness, and his mind still carried the discipline of a prisoner waiting for the next instruction. Andersonville was not simply a place they had left behind. It was a name that stayed with them in their bodies, in the weight they had lost, and in the illnesses that freedom did not immediately cure. The prison in Georgia had become one of the most notorious places of the Civil War, crowded with Union prisoners in conditions that exposed men to hunger, contaminated water, inadequate shelter, and disease. Thousands died there before they ever had a chance to hear that the war was ending. Those who survived did not walk out untouched. Some left with strength so badly reduced that survival itself seemed unfinished, as if they had escaped the camp without escaping what the camp had done to them. Cahaba gave other prisoners a different route out of confinement, but release from its walls still meant another stage of waiting, marching, counting, and being moved through a broken country. The Alabama prison was not remembered in the same way as Andersonville, yet many of its inmates also emerged from overcrowded wartime confinement into uncertainty rather than comfort. In early 1865, flooding added another ordeal for prisoners there, forcing men already weakened by captivity to endure cold water and worsening conditions before their release. To survive Cahaba was not to be ready for travel. It was only to be alive when the next order came. Reaching Vicksburg required more than permission to go home, because men already weakened by captivity still had to endure the slow process of being transferred toward the river. The war had damaged the South's roads, rail lines, towns, and supply systems, and even organised movement could be hard on men who needed food, treatment, and rest more than speed. Some former prisoners had been shifted from camp to camp, or moved in groups under military handling before they reached the Mississippi. Each stage looked like progress, but progress could still drain what little strength remained. The distance between prison and home was not measured only in miles, it was measured in how much the men could still endure. Near the Mississippi, freedom became another crowded holding place, where former prisoners waited under military control, while transport officers tried to move thousands of men north as quickly as possible. Vicksburg was not a peaceful homecoming station, it was a military funnel, a place where released soldiers gathered because the river offered a way out. Men who had dreamed of their own beds now had to wait in groups, answer to procedures, depend on officers, and accept whatever transport became available. The closeness of the river made the delay more painful. The way home was visible, but it still belonged to the system moving them. Hunger made refusal unlikely, sickness made protest difficult, and the long discipline of military life made many of the men follow instructions even when the arrangements around them looked uncertain. A civilian traveller might hesitate before boarding an overloaded boat or complain about being pressed into a dangerous space. But these men had been trained by war and captivity to obey orders that came from above. They had spent months with little control over food, shelter, movement, or timing. To question the final transport north would have required energy, confidence, and leverage that many no longer had. They were not in a position to negotiate with the machinery that promised to carry them home. Home had become such a powerful idea that discomfort could be mistaken for a small price, especially by men who had survived conditions far worse than a crowded deck. A place aboard any northbound steamboat meant movement, and movement meant distance from the prison camps that had nearly consumed them. If the boat looked full, that did not necessarily mean it looked fatal. To men who had slept in overcrowded stockades, endured hunger, and watched others die before release came, the press of bodies around them might have seemed miserable but familiar. The terrible danger was that captivity had lowered the threshold of alarm. What should have looked like a warning could be mistaken for one last hardship. At the docks, suffering was gradually converted into numbers, with weakened soldiers becoming entries on rolls, groups to be assigned, and passengers to be placed wherever space could be found. The men had names, regiments, homes, wounds, illnesses, and families waiting somewhere beyond the river, but the transport system could not fully hold those details. It needed counts, it needed groups, it needed movement. Once the men were treated as a mass to be transferred, their individual condition became easier to overlook. A sick man and a healthy man could occupy the same line on a passenger list, even though only one of them might have the strength to survive a fire, a fall, a swim, or a night in cold water. No warning was more visible than the men themselves, yet their condition was treated as a problem of transportation, rather than a sign that another emergency would be almost impossible for them to survive. Their weakness mattered before anything went wrong. It mattered as they climbed, waited, leaned, slept, and tried to find space among strangers who had suffered the same long captivity. It mattered because disaster does not strike everybody equally. A strong man might fight through smoke, leap clear of wreckage, cling to floating debris, or battle a current until rescue came. A starving or sick man might have only moments before strength failed him. Ahead of them waited the vessel that seemed to promise movement at last, its deck soon to carry not only passengers, but the accumulated weight of everything the war had already done to them. The Sultana was not yet the burning wreck that history would remember. It was still a steamboat at the river, part of a familiar world of whistles, gangplanks, smoke, orders, and crowded movement. To the men waiting to board, it represented the opposite of confinement. It meant north. It meant distance. It meant that prison was behind them, and that the last official barrier between captivity and home was finally beginning to open. Their weakened bodies were counted as passengers, before anyone truly considered what kind of vessel was being asked to carry them. A steamboat built for hundreds, loaded with thousands. Measured against those bodies, the waiting steamboat became more than transportation. It became the next unanswered question in a journey that had already taken too much from the men moving toward it. From the landing, the Sultana may not have looked like a warning. It had the shape and confidence of a working Mississippi riverboat, the kind of vessel people along the river had seen for years, with decks rising above the water and smokestacks marking it as part of the restless traffic of the war's final months. It seemed to offer the same thing the river offered: movement. But a boat can appear capable from a distance while already being asked to carry more than its structure, space, and purpose were meant to bear. Rising from the Mississippi with its paddle wheels, tall stacks, and layered decks, the Sultana looked like part of the familiar river world that had carried people, cargo, and military traffic through the war. It was not an ancient or decaying vessel when it arrived at this moment in history. The Sultana had been launched in Cincinnati in January of 1863, during the middle of the Civil War, and had spent its brief working life moving along the Mississippi system. It was a side-wheel steamboat, a vessel designed for the river's long commercial routes, where steam power, cargo space, passengers, and shallow water movement made boats like it essential to transportation. Nothing in its ordinary appearance announced that it would become the centre of America's worst maritime disaster. From a distance, its size could create the dangerous impression of safety, because a large riverboat looked capable long before anyone considered how much weight it was actually meant to bear. The Sultana was about 260 feet long and roughly 42 feet wide at the beam, dimensions that could make it seem substantial when viewed from the bank or the landing. It had multiple decks, broad visible surfaces, and the kind of height that gave steamboats their commanding presence on the river. To men desperate to go home, the boat's size might have seemed reassuring. To officials trying to move thousands of former prisoners quickly, it may have looked like an answer. But appearance was not capacity, and capacity was the detail that mattered most. Built as a commercial sidewheel steamboat, the Sultana had limits that were not mysterious, hidden, or impossible to know, even if those limits were about to be ignored. Its legal passenger capacity was only a few hundred, most commonly given as 376, with a working crew often listed at around 85. Those numbers did not describe a weakness in the boat, they described its intended use. The Sultana was not built to function as a floating camp, a military barracks, or a mass evacuation platform for thousands of men weakened by disease and captivity. It was built to move within known limits, and the tragedy began to take shape when those limits were treated as flexible instead of fixed. Legal capacity told one story, but the crowd pressing toward the gangways told another, turning a vessel meant for hundreds into a temporary holding place for thousands. By the time the Sultana left Vicksburg, it was carrying a number of people far beyond what it had been designed to hold. Accounts differ slightly in the exact total, but the figure is usually placed above 2,000, with the overwhelming majority made up of paroled Union soldiers. The difference between a few hundred and more than 2,000 was not a small miscalculation. It changed the meaning of every deck, every rail, every stairway, and every narrow route through the boat. It turned space into pressure. Space vanished first in the places passengers were supposed to move through, as decks, walkways, and open areas became crowded with men who had nowhere else to stand, sit, or sleep. These were not passengers spreading naturally through cabins and open sections, choosing places for comfort during an ordinary trip. The civilian cabin spaces were already limited, and the former prisoners were placed wherever room could be found. Men filled open decks and crowded into areas never meant to hold so many bodies for a long journey upriver. Movement became difficult before the boat even faced the current. The Sultana was still floating, still recognizable, still outwardly functioning, but its interior life had already changed into something compressed and unstable. Above the hull, every added body changed the meaning of the vessel's upper levels, making height, weight, balance, and escape part of the danger before the boat had even left the dock. A steamboat's layered decks were part of its normal design, but overcrowding turned those levels into loaded platforms. The more men were placed above, the more the boat carried not only passengers, but vertical strain. Reports of the overcrowded Sultana described decks so burdened that they sagged in places and required support. That detail matters because it shows how visible the overload had become. The danger was not hidden inside a future event. It was present in the physical behaviour of the vessel as human weight pressed down on surfaces that had never been meant to hold such numbers. Steam power gave the riverboat its strength, but it also placed heat, pressure, fuel, wood and machinery inside the same crowded world where weakened passengers were being packed together. 19th century riverboats depended on boilers and engines to push against the current, and the Sultana was part of that technology-driven world where speed and power came with constant risk. Its wooden construction belonged to a river era in which fire was always a feared possibility, even on a vessel operating normally. The point was not that steamboats were unusual dangers by themselves. The point was that the Sultana's normal risks were now surrounded by abnormal crowding. Everything that required space, movement, response and control had less of it. Crowding did not need flames or broken timber to become dangerous, because it had already narrowed the routes through which men would have to move if panic ever began. The former prisoners had recently come from confinement, and now many found themselves pressed together again, not behind stockade walls but within the railings and decks of a riverboat. If an emergency occurred, escape would not be a simple matter of standing up and walking away. Men would have to climb over other men, find their direction in darkness, fight through blocked passages, or reach the edge of the boat while surrounded by hundreds who were trying to do the same. Overcrowding had quietly stolen time from any future rescue, before danger had even announced itself. For men recently freed from confinement, the packed decks created a cruel echo of captivity, replacing prison walls with bodies, railings, orders, and the river on every side. They had technically been released, but the physical reality around them still offered little control. They could not choose the boat. They could not choose the number aboard. They could not create room where none remained. The difference was that this new confinement moved north, and because it moved, it could still be mistaken for freedom. That was one of the most haunting contradictions of the Sultana. The men were closer to home than they had been in months, yet their ability to protect themselves may have been shrinking with every additional body forced onto the decks. No single glance could reveal the whole danger, but the overloaded decks, strained spaces and human weight aboard the Sultana had already changed the vessel into something it had never been built to become. It was still a steamboat in name and appearance, but in function it had become a crowded vessel of exhausted men, limited exits, wooden construction, steam machinery, and ignored capacity. Long before the river turned dark around it, the Sultana had already become a trap built from ordinary things used beyond their limits. Its danger did not require mystery to exist. It only required people to look at number meant for hundreds and behave as if thousands could be carried the same way. Before the river could test the Sultana, the choices that filled its decks had already begun to close around it. The deal that filled every deck. Decisions made away from the gangplank had already begun shaping the crowd, long before the first exhausted soldier found a place on the Sultana's decks. The danger was not created only by tired men moving toward a boat or by a steamboat with limited space waiting at the river. It was also created in the quieter machinery behind the loading, where transportation became business, business became pressure, and pressure began to erase caution. At Vicksburg, the former prisoners were not simply being rescued by whichever vessel could safely carry them. They were being assigned, counted, negotiated over, and moved through a system where every additional passenger could mean additional money. That was where the disaster took on another shape, not as an accident of confusion alone, but as something pushed forward by human decisions. Payment changed the meaning of the men waiting at Vicksburg. because each transported soldier represented not only a life to be returned north, but money to be collected. Steamboat captains could receive government payment for carrying paroled Union soldiers up the Mississippi, with higher fares for officers than enlisted men. The exact rates appear differently across historical accounts, but the central danger remains the same. The arrangement rewarded the number of men carried. A captain who secured a large group of released prisoners could make a profitable trip. In a moment when thousands of weakened soldiers were waiting for transport, that incentive quietly changed the atmosphere at the docks. The men were still survivors. They were still sons, husbands, brothers and soldiers. But inside the transport system, they could also be treated as a load with a price attached. Captain James Cass Mason entered this moment with a vessel to fill and a powerful reason to secure as many paroled prisoners as the transport system would allow. He was the master of the Sultana, and the chance to carry released soldiers north offered the kind of financial return that no ordinary passenger run could match. The war had made steamboats essential, but it had also made their captains dependent on contracts, government use, river conditions, and the uncertain flow of military business. Mason did not have to imagine the value of a crowded boat. The value was visible in the numbers. More prisoners meant more fare meant more profit. Once that calculation entered the story, the Sultana's decks were no longer just open spaces waiting to be filled. They became places where money could be stacked in human form. Quartermaster authority at Vicksburg gave certain officials control over movement, assignment, and access, placing the fate of thousands of released men inside decisions they could not see. Captain Reuben Benton Hatch, associated with the quartermaster operation there, became one of the most controversial figures in the Sultana disaster. Historical accounts have long connected him to the arrangement that helped steer the prisoners toward Mason's boat. The former captives waiting outside Vicksburg could not inspect the motives of the men deciding their transport. They could not know which captain had made which promise, which officer controlled which list, or whether another vessel might have been safer. They were at the end of a chain of command, and the most important decisions about their movement were made above them. Behind the apparent urgency of transportation, historical accounts point to an arrangement in which profit and influence helped override the caution that overcrowding should have demanded. The accusations surrounding Mason and Hatch are not a minor detail added after the tragedy. They go to the heart of why so many men ended up on a single boat. Hatch was said to have offered Mason access to a large number of prisoners in exchange for a share of the proceeds, and Mason was said to have accepted because the passenger load was valuable. Whether described as a bribe, a kickback, or a corrupt bargain, the meaning was devastatingly clear. The more men placed on the Sultana, the more profitable the voyage became, even as every additional body made the vessel less fit for the journey. Available space on other vessels makes the concentration aboard the Sultana more troubling, because the disaster was not shaped only by shortage, but by choices about where the men were sent. The Mississippi River was not empty of steamboats, and wartime transport did not depend on one vessel alone. Yet the Sultana received an impossible number of released prisoners, far beyond what its legal capacity allowed. That fact makes the loading feel less like a simple emergency and more like a failure of judgment inside a system that should have distributed danger rather than concentrated it. A safer arrangement would have required delay, coordination, or the use of more boats. But delay threatened profit, coordination required discipline, and splitting the prisoners among other vessels meant the Sultana would lose part of the load that made the trip so valuable. Paperwork gave the loading an official appearance, yet roles, counts, and assignments could hide danger when the numbers being moved became more important than the vessel receiving them. The former prisoners had to be organised through parole records and military procedures, and such systems can make human suffering look orderly even when the reality is unstable. Men became units in a count, and once a number was written or accepted, the physical meaning of that number could be ignored. A figure on paper did not show how thin the men were, how crowded the decks would become, or how little room would remain if something went wrong. Bureaucracy gave the movement a shape of authority, but authority did not make the decision safe. Officials looking at the gathered prisoners could treat them as a transport problem, even though the growing mass of bodies on one boat was already becoming a warning. The pressure was real. Thousands of men needed to move north. The war had ended, families were waiting, and the government wanted released soldiers out of temporary camps and back toward their states. But a real need can still be used to excuse a dangerous choice. The question was not whether the men should be sent home. They should have been. The question was why so many were placed on one vessel, and why the obvious risk of overcrowding did not stop the process before it hardened into fact. Speed offered an easy excuse for risk, because everyone wanted the former prisoners moved north quickly, and urgency can make dangerous shortcuts appear necessary. The men wanted the journey to begin. Officers wanted the parole camp cleared. Boat operators wanted profitable loads. The nation wanted the war's loose ends tied up as fast as possible. In that atmosphere, a full boat could be mistaken for efficiency, and efficiency could be mistaken for success. But the Sultana's story shows how dangerous that mistake can become. Moving people quickly is not the same as moving them safely, especially when the people being moved are weakened former prisoners, and the vessel carrying them is already beyond reasonable limits. Greed made the suffering useful to others, turning men who had barely survived captivity into a crowded source of payment before they had fully recovered their freedom. This is one of the darkest parts of the Sultana disaster, because the men's vulnerability did not protect them. It made them easier to move. They had little power to refuse, little knowledge of the arrangements, and little strength to challenge the conditions around them. Their desire to go home made them cooperative. Their weakened state made them dependent. Their numbers made them profitable. The same suffering that should have demanded care became part of the reason they could be packed aboard with so little resistance. Once the decks began to fill, the crowd became the visible result of quieter decisions made in offices, negotiations, and orders before the Sultana ever pulled away. Every man who stepped aboard added weight, but he also represented a prior choice. Someone had allowed the number to grow. Someone had accepted the assignment. Someone had treated the boat as if its limits could bend around profit. By the time the Sultana's decks were covered with paroled soldiers, the corruption no longer needed to be hidden in conversation. It had become visible in the press of bodies, the crowded passageways, the strained decks, and the impossibility of moving freely from one part of the vessel to another. The disaster was not yet visible as fire or wreckage, but its outline was already there. The same pressure that packed the boat also made another warning easier to dismiss, because stopping the voyage now meant interrupting a journey already turned into profit. The boiler that should have stopped everything. Inside the vessel, that warning had already taken shape in metal, heat, pressure, and a problem serious enough to interrupt the Sultana before its most crowded journey began. The danger was not only visible in the number of men gathering near the decks, or in the pressure to move them north before another boat could take them. It was also hidden within the machinery that made the steamboat move at all, in the part of the vessel most passengers would never understand closely, but every life aboard depended on completely. A riverboat could look steady from the outside, its stacks rising with confidence, and its decks filling with men who believed the worst was behind them, while below and within it, a quieter question waited unanswered: whether the power that carried the boat forward was safe enough to be trusted. Trouble with the machinery emerged at Vicksburg at the worst possible moment, when the boat was close to securing the human load that made the voyage so profitable. The Sultana had arrived there with a boiler problem that required attention before it continued upriver. In any other circumstance, such a defect might have forced the voyage to slow down, lose time, and accept the inconvenience of a proper repair. But this was not an ordinary stop, and the Sultana was not waiting for an ordinary passenger list. Released Union prisoners were being gathered for transport, and the vessel's value to its captain depended on leaving with as many of them as possible. The damaged boiler did not appear in a calm moment. It appeared exactly where caution and profit were already in conflict. Boilers were the hidden force behind a riverboat's confidence, turning water and fire into motion while demanding constant trust in seams, plates, pressure, and repair. To people watching from the bank, a steamboat could seem almost graceful, its paddle wheels turning through the muddy current and its upper decks rising like a moving building above the water. But that movement came from a harsher interior world, where fire heated water, steam built under pressure, and metal had to contain forces that could become deadly if mismanaged. A boiler was not just another piece of equipment, it was the heart of the vessel's motion, and a flaw in that heart was never only mechanical. It was a warning about every mile still ahead. Repair should have meant delay, and delay should have forced everyone involved to reconsider whether the Sultana was fit to leave with so many lives aboard. Accounts of the stop at Vicksburg describe a boiler that needed more serious work than it ultimately received. with repair advice pointing toward a longer and more thorough job. Replacing damaged boiler sheets or cutting out the weakened section would have taken time, and time was exactly what Captain James Cass Mason did not want to lose. A full repair could have kept the boat in port long enough for the former prisoners to be assigned elsewhere. What should have been a question of safety became entangled with the fear of missing the load that made the trip valuable. Minutes and money began to outweigh caution, because a longer repair could have allowed the waiting prisoners to be assigned to other transports. The Sultana's captain had already been drawn into a situation where the overcrowded passenger load meant profit, and every hour of delay threatened that arrangement. Waiting for a proper repair was not just inconvenient, it risked the entire reason the boat had become so important at Vicksburg. Another steamboat might arrive, another officer might redirect the soldiers, another decision might break the chain that had placed so many men within Mason's reach. In that pressure, the damaged boiler became not a barrier to departure, but an obstacle to be managed quickly enough to keep the deal alive. Mason's urgency made the boiler problem part of the same chain of decisions that had already filled the decks beyond any reasonable limit. The earlier danger had been created by treating human beings as a profitable load. Now a second danger emerged from treating a mechanical defect as something that could be handled just well enough to avoid delay. The logic was similar in both cases. Limits were recognised only long enough to be worked around. The boat's passenger capacity could be ignored because the money was too tempting. The boiler's damage could be patched because waiting was too costly. Each decision made sense only if the voyage itself mattered more than the condition of the vessel or the lives aboard it. A patch could make departure possible without making the danger disappear, creating the appearance of readiness while leaving the original weakness inside the boat. That is what makes the repair so disturbing in the story of the Sultana. A temporary fix can change the look of a problem without changing its meaning. It can allow a captain to say the boat is repaired, allow loading to continue, allow officers to believe the journey can proceed, and allow the crowd to gather under the illusion that the machinery has been dealt with. But a patched boiler was not the same as a fully restored one, especially on a vessel already carrying far more weight and human dependence than it had ever been meant to bear. While the repair was being handled below, the scene above continued to grow heavier, with more men entering a vessel whose machinery had already given reason to stop. The contrast is what gives this moment its quiet dread. On one level, tools, metal, and pressure were being treated as a problem to be solved quickly. On another, sick and exhausted men were being packed into place for the voyage north. These two realities were not separate. The more crowded the boat became, the more catastrophic any failure would be. The more valuable the crowd became, the harder it was to justify the delay that safety demanded. Above and below, the Sultana was being pushed toward departure by forces that did not care enough about warning signs. Readiness became a convenient conclusion, not because every doubt had been answered, but because the voyage had become too valuable to hold back. Once the repair was accepted, the boat could continue preparing to leave, and the damaged boiler receded from immediate attention. That is often how preventable disasters move forward, not because no one sees a problem, but because the problem is made small enough to fit the decision already desired. A leak becomes a repair, a patch becomes permission, a delay becomes unnecessary. The Sultana did not need every man involved to believe the vessel was perfectly safe. It only needed enough people to act as if the warning had been handled. After the tools were put away, the damaged boiler remained part of the journey, carried north with the same passengers whose presence made delay harder to accept. Nothing about the repair erased the conditions around it. The boat was still overcrowded, the men were still weakened, the river ahead was still swollen and demanding. The machinery still had to work under pressure as the Sultana moved against the current. The warning that should have stopped everything had not vanished. It had simply been covered, accepted, and folded into the voyage as if the act of continuing could make it less dangerous. The boat was not leaving Vicksburg free from trouble. It was leaving with trouble sealed inside it. Before departure erased the chance to look again, the Sultana still offered two kinds of evidence, one hidden in its machinery and one gathering in plain sight across its crowded decks. The boiler problem belonged to the interior of the vessel, to repair decisions, metal plates, pressure, and the private urgency of men who did not want the trip delayed. But the other evidence required no technical knowledge. It could be seen from the riverbank by anyone who looked at the boat as it sat heavy with paroled soldiers. The Sultana's danger had one warning that had been patched out of sight, and another that was about to be captured in a single image of men crowded so densely that the vessel itself seemed to disappear beneath them. One danger had been covered and sent back into service, while another was about to be preserved on the riverbank for anyone willing to look closely. A photograph before the disaster. Preserved in a single image, the warning from the riverbank appears almost silent at first, crowded with faces, uniforms, railings, and the uneasy stillness of men who did not yet know what the camera had captured. The Sultana had already gathered too many signs around itself. A passenger load far beyond reason, a patched boiler, a captain under pressure, and former prisoners too worn down to question the conditions carrying them north. But the photograph does something different from every account written afterward. It does not argue, explain, accuse, or remember. It simply holds the boat in place for one moment, showing a vessel that still floated, still breathed steam, still promised home, and yet already looked as if danger had climbed aboard with everyone else. Helena, Arkansas became the brief pause where the northbound Sultana was held in view, not as a wreck or a legend, but as a living vessel still carrying its passengers toward home. On April 26, 1865, the steamboat stopped there along the Mississippi, only one day before the disaster that would make its name impossible to separate from death. The town was not the final destination. It was not the place where the explosion came. It was only one stop on a journey that seemed to be continuing normally, another river point between Vicksburg and the north. That ordinariness makes the image more disturbing, because nothing in the moment announces itself as final. The boat is not burning, the river is not yet filled with men, the decks are still intact, the story has not broken open. Thomas W. Banks raised his camera toward a scene that looked historic for one reason, while time would soon make it remembered for something far more disturbing. A crowded steamboat full of returning Union soldiers would have been worth recording in the spring of 1865, when the war was ending, and men who had been held in Confederate prisons were finally moving home. The photograph could have remained a document of reunion, release, and national transition, a record of soldiers leaving the South behind after years of war. Instead, it became something colder. It became one of the last surviving visual records of men who were not yet victims in the image, though many of them would soon be counted that way. Across the decks, the crowd overwhelms the boat's shape, turning the Sultana from a steamboat into a layered mass of soldiers pressed against every visible level. The vessel can still be recognized by its stacks, rails, and upper structure, but the human presence dominates the scene so completely that the boat seems almost buried beneath the men it carries. They stand along railings, gather across decks, and fill the visible spaces where passengers should have been able to move. The photograph gives the overcrowding a physical reality that numbers alone cannot provide. A figure in a report can be debated or forgotten, but the image shows the problem in plain sight. The Sultana was not merely full, it was visibly overwhelmed. Faces in the photograph hold the chapter's deepest unease, because they belong to men who had survived captivity without knowing the journey itself had become the next threat. Most of them appear too distant for individual expression to be clearly read, yet that distance makes the image more haunting rather than less. The men become a collective presence, a crowd suspended between the prison camps behind them and the dark water ahead. Some may have believed the hardest part of their lives was already over. Some may have been thinking only of food, sleep, distance, or family. None of them could see the photograph the way history sees it now, as a still frame taken near the edge of catastrophe. Seen after the disaster, the image stops feeling like a record of transport and begins to resemble evidence that the danger had been visible before the river ever turned violent. The crowded decks confirm what earlier warnings had already suggested. The Sultana had taken on more men than it was built to carry. The passengers had little space, little control, and little chance of moving quickly if panic began. The danger did not need hindsight to exist, even if hindsight makes it impossible to ignore. Anyone looking at the photograph now can see the disaster forming in plain view, not through flames or wreckage, but through density, weight, and the terrible closeness of bodies that should never have been placed together in such numbers. Stillness gives the photograph its power, because the boat appears fixed and quiet while everything inside its story was already moving toward pressure, darkness, and collapse. A photograph removes the sound from a moment. It silences the river, the machinery, the orders, the conversations, the shifting weight of men on decks, and the low mechanical life of the steamboat itself. What remains is the illusion of pause. But the Sultana was not truly paused in history. Its boiler had already been patched, its passenger load had already been gathered, its path north had already been chosen. The still image only interrupts the motion long enough for the warning to be seen. Anyone studying the image closely can see that the overcrowding was not a hidden flaw, not a secret defect, and not something known only after the explosion. This is what makes the photograph so important within the disaster. It shows that one of the most obvious dangers was public, visible, and physical. Men were packed across the boat in numbers that changed the meaning of the vessel. The image cannot show every decision that led to the loading, and it cannot reveal the condition of the boiler beneath the decks, but it shows enough to disturb the viewer. It shows that the Sultana carried its warning on the outside, even while another warning remained sealed within. Shortly after Helena, the Sultana would leave behind the last clear visual record of its overcrowded decks and continue into the final stretch of its northbound journey. The photograph remained on the bank, fixed in chemicals and paper, while the actual boat moved on into distance, current and night. That separation gives the image its strange weight. It is both proof and farewell. It captures the men while they are still alive, the boat while it is still whole, and the crowd while it is still waiting for movement rather than fighting for survival. What happened afterward would be remembered through testimony, recovery, reports, and grief, but this was the last moment where the disaster could still be seen before it became one. Silence settles over the photograph because it captures the boat before sound returns to the story, before engines, current, darkness, and distance begin carrying it away from the bank. The image does not show the river's strength or the swollen water ahead. It does not show the strain of pushing north, the weight shifting across decks, or the long miles still remaining before Memphis. It only shows the Sultana in a moment that seems still enough to study and too late to change. The camera had preserved what the transport system ignored, a vessel already crowded into danger, carrying men who believed they were finally on the last part of the way home. The still image ended at the shoreline, but the next miles belonged to a swollen river that would not hold anything in place. North through a flooded river. Beyond the frame left behind at Helena, the Sultana returned to motion, pushing north into water that had risen beyond its ordinary banks and made the river feel less like a route than a force. The photograph remained behind as proof of what the eye could see, but the vessel itself moved on, carrying its crowded decks away from daylight, away from the shoreline, and deeper into the final stretch of its journey. Everything that had been still in the image became active again. The engines had to work, the current had to be fought, the overloaded decks had to remain balanced above a river that was no longer calm enough to be treated as background. After Helena, the danger was no longer only something visible from the bank, it was something the Sultana had to carry through moving water. Floodwater changed the Mississippi's character, spreading its current into low places, hiding familiar edges, and turning an already powerful river into something harder to read from the decks of an overloaded boat. In the spring of 1865, the river was swollen by seasonal flooding, and high water could make the familiar channel seem wider, darker, and less predictable. Banks became less definite. Trees, debris, and submerged hazards could be harder to judge. A river that served as a highway in ordinary times could become a shifting landscape when it rose beyond itself. For a northbound steamboat, that mattered. The Sultana was not simply floating with the river, it was trying to move against it. Against that current, the Sultana had to keep working, its engines and boilers driving the vessel upstream while the river pressed back with every mile. Travelling north on the Mississippi meant pushing against the natural movement of the water, and that required steady power from the machinery that had already been trusted once too many questions were set aside. The river did not need to be violent in the dramatic sense to be dangerous. Its force could be constant, patient, and exhausting, demanding pressure from the boilers and persistence from the engines, while the vessel carried more human weight than it should have held. Every mile upriver became a negotiation between motion and resistance. Weight mattered differently once the boat was underway, because the crowd that had looked alarming in a photograph now became part of the strain carried through moving water. At the landing, overcrowding had appeared as a visual warning, a mass of men covering rails and decks until the boat seemed almost swallowed by its passengers. On the river, that same crowd became part of the vessel's behaviour. Men shifted, slept, leaned, crowded together, and occupied spaces not meant to hold such numbers. The Sultana still had to turn, push, balance, and respond to the current beneath it. What had looked like evidence at Helena became a living burden in motion. Open banks did not mean easy safety, especially for men packed aboard at night, weakened by captivity and separated from shore by floodwater, darkness, and current. The riverbank could seem close in imagination, but distance on a flooded river is different from distance on land. A man could see trees or lights and still be far from safety if the water was cold, fast, and wide. Many aboard had survived prison only to enter a situation where their bodies had little reserve left. If anything forced them into the river, they would not be stepping onto solid ground. They would be entering a moving surface that could scatter them, pull them under debris, or carry them away from help before anyone could reach them. Darkness slowly altered the voyage, taking away the visible certainty of the riverbank and leaving passengers with the sounds of machinery, water, and bodies settling into limited space. Night on a crowded riverboat would have narrowed the world around the passengers. The men could no longer read the river as clearly, and the banks would have faded into shadows except where lights or settlements broke the dark. The Sultana's movement became something felt more than seen. The rhythm of engines, the vibration of the boat, the pressure of nearby bodies, the cold air, and the heavy presence of water on every side. The further the night deepened, the more the journey depended on trust. Sleep came to some of the men as the boat moved on, not because the journey was safe, but because exhaustion can silence fear when the body has nothing left to spend. These were men who had been moved through captivity, release, waiting, and transport with little real rest. A crowded deck was not comfortable, but comfort was no longer the standard by which many of them measured relief. They had a place aboard. The boat was moving north. The prison camps were behind them. For men drained by months of hunger and uncertainty, even a dangerous voyage could contain moments where the body simply surrendered to sleep. That vulnerability made the night more haunting, because rest came only after every warning had already been carried forward. Nothing had stopped the Sultana yet, and that ordinary continuation may have made the danger harder to recognize while the vessel kept pushing north. Disasters often become clearer afterward than they ever feel in the hours before they happen. As long as the boat moved, as long as the engines worked, as long as the river carried no immediate sign that the journey could not continue, the situation could still resemble success. The Sultana had left Vicksburg. It had passed Helena. It was moving toward Memphis. Each completed stretch could make the next one feel possible. The very fact that the vessel continued may have helped conceal how much risk had travelled with it from the start. Memphis drew closer along the dark river, but nearness to a city did not remove the danger from a boat still crowded, strained, and moving through flooded water. The Sultana was approaching one of the most important river cities in the region, a place of docks, hospitals, military presence, and human activity. Yet proximity did not equal rescue. The river remained between the passengers and safety. The night remained around them. The boat still carried the same crowd, the same pressure, and the same hidden uncertainty inside its machinery. Being near Memphis meant the journey had advanced, but it did not mean the Sultana had escaped the conditions that made the final miles so dangerous. Final miles gathered around the vessel with a deceptive calm as the river, machinery, sleeping passengers, and hidden pressure moved together through the night. The story had not yet reached the violent moment that would define it, and that is what makes this stretch so unsettling. There was still motion, still darkness, still the ordinary sound of a steamboat fighting its way north. Above the water, men rested wherever they could. Beneath and within the vessel, the power system continued doing the work required to push upstream. Around all of it, the flooded Mississippi kept moving in its own direction, indifferent to the human hope piled across the decks. In the dark reach above Memphis, the Sultana moved through a silence deep enough to hide the last warning before everything changed, the last quiet minutes before the blast. Within that silence, the final minutes gathered without ceremony, settling over crowded decks where exhaustion made stillness look almost like safety. The Sultana was still moving through the dark reach above Memphis, and because it was moving, the danger could still hide behind the appearance of a journey continuing as planned. Nothing had yet torn through the decks. No panic had yet forced men toward the railings. No flames had yet changed the river into the only escape left. For those aboard, the boat remained a crowded passage north, uncomfortable and strained, but still alive beneath them. That was the cruel calm of the final stretch. Everything that should have stopped the voyage had already been carried forward, and now all of it was gathered in one place, waiting inside a night that gave no warning clear enough to wake the men who needed it most. Shoulder to shoulder in the dark, men rested wherever the overloaded boat gave them room, their bodies too worn from captivity and travel to remain watchful for long. Some had likely found space on open decks, pressed near strangers who had survived the same prison camps, the same transfers, and the same uncertain release. Others may have sat upright, leaned against railings, or slept in whatever position the crowd allowed. The Sultana had not been arranged for their comfort, and by then comfort may have mattered less than the fact that the boat was still headed north. After months of hunger and confinement, sleep could come not as peace, but as surrender. Their bodies had been trained by suffering to accept whatever place was available, even when that place offered almost no protection. Progress itself became part of the illusion, because the Sultana was still moving, still breathing steam, and still appearing to carry its passengers through the last miles home. A vessel in motion can create its own false reassurance. The paddle wheels turned, the engines worked, the current was resisted. The boat had left Vicksburg, moved past Helena, and continued through the night toward the region around Memphis. Every completed mile could seem to prove that the earlier risks had been survived. The overloaded decks had not yet collapsed into catastrophe. The patched boiler had not yet stopped the boat. The swollen river had not yet taken control. To anyone who did not know what was building inside the vessel, movement itself could feel like evidence that the journey would hold. Beneath that crowded calm, pressure remained out of sight, held inside the same machinery that had already been trusted after warning signs were set aside. The passengers did not need to understand boilers to depend on them. Their lives rested on metal, water, fire, and steam doing exactly what they were supposed to do, under conditions that allowed no margin for sudden failure. A boiler problem had already appeared at Vicksburg, and a quicker repair had allowed the Sultana to continue, but a repair accepted under pressure did not erase the physical reality of the system. As the boat pushed upstream, the machinery still had to produce power against the river's resistance. The danger was not visible in the faces of sleeping men, but it was travelling with them all the same. Ordinary sounds could disguise danger on a riverboat, where engine rhythm, water against the hull, and the low movement of passengers belonged to the expected language of travel. A creak, a vibration, a rush of water, or the steady labour of machinery might not have seemed alarming by itself. Riverboats were noisy, living things, full of motion even when passengers tried to sleep. Wood shifted, steam worked, men coughed, turned, muttered, and settled against one another in crowded spaces. The problem was that normal sound can conceal abnormal risk when everyone has become accustomed to discomfort. On the Sultana, the familiar noises of travel may have made the final moments feel ordinary, even as the conditions behind those sounds were anything but safe. 7 miles above Memphis, safety was close enough to imagine, but not close enough to protect anyone if the river suddenly became part of the disaster. The city was not impossibly far away. Its presence along the Mississippi gave the journey a sense of nearing help: docks, hospitals, military organisation, and human activity. Yet distance on a dark, flooded river was measured differently from distance on land. A few miles could become immense if men were thrown into cold water, separated from the boat, injured before they could swim, or carried away by current. Memphis was close in geography, but the passengers were still isolated by night, water, weakness, and the fragile shell of the vessel carrying them. Exhaustion left the passengers defenceless in a quieter way, because men who had survived prison, hunger, and transfer were now asleep inside the next danger. Their greatest vulnerability in those minutes was not only that they were crowded or weakened or surrounded by water, it was that many had reason to let their guard fall at the worst possible time. They were not waiting for battle. They were not braced for attack. They were not standing at attention with weapons in their hands. They were returning home, or trying to believe they were. The war had already taken so much from them that the ordinary act of resting became tragic in hindsight, because their bodies finally stopped resisting just as the vessel around them approached its breaking point. Unmarked minutes passed across the vessel without announcing themselves as final, moving through the dark with no signal that history was narrowing around the boat. Later, accounts would fix the disaster near 2 o'clock in the morning on April 27th, 1865, giving the event a time and place that could be recorded. But the men aboard did not live those minutes as a historical marker. They lived them as continuation, another mile, another breath, another vibration under the deck, another moment in which the riverboat still existed beneath them. The most disturbing part of those last minutes is that they did not have to feel extraordinary to the people inside them. Catastrophe often arrives after ordinary time has done nothing to reveal that it is ending. Every earlier warning had arrived together now, not as separate mistakes, but as one crowded vessel pushing through night, floodwater, hidden pressure, and human vulnerability. The weakened prisoners, the overloaded decks, the rushed repair, the money behind the loading, the swollen Mississippi, and the darkness above Memphis were no longer separate parts of the story. They had converged into one moving place. The Sultana carried all of them at once, and that convergence made the final stretch more than a mechanical failure waiting to happen. It was a chain of decisions and conditions reaching its last link. No single warning needed to explain everything, because the boat had become the place where all the warnings met. Calm held its place, because nothing had failed yet, and that brief continuation made the Sultana seem safer than it truly was. The men did not know they were inside the final pause before one of the deadliest maritime disasters in American history. They knew only the limited facts available to them in the dark. The boat was moving, the river was beneath them, and home was somewhere ahead. That is what gives the moment its terrible restraint. There was no dramatic announcement, no visible boundary between ordinary travel and irreversible disaster. The last calm did not protect them. It only made the coming violence harder to imagine. On the edge of catastrophe, the river, the machinery and the sleeping deck seemed suspended in one last moment before sound returned with unimaginable force. The Sultana was still whole, the passengers were still aboard, the current still moved around the hull, and the machinery still carried pressure inside the vessel's body. In that final suspended instant, everything remained recognizable. A steamboat, a crowded deck, exhausted men, dark water, and a journey that still appeared to be continuing. Then the story reached the place where stillness could no longer hold. The night finally split from within the boat, turning every hidden warning into sound. The explosion that tore the night open. Sound became destruction before the men could understand it, erupting upward through the Sultana and turning sleep into terror in the space of a breath. One moment, the steamboat was still part of the dark river, crowded, strained, and moving through the final hours of a journey that had already carried too many warnings. The next, the vessel was no longer simply travelling north. It was breaking apart from within. The force did not arrive as something the passengers could prepare for or even recognise in its first instant. It tore through the illusion that the boat was still holding together, and in that first violent rupture, every ignored danger became physical at once. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 of the steamboat's 4 boilers exploded north of Memphis, sending force through the vessel where hundreds of exhausted passengers had been resting. Accounts described the first boiler giving way, followed almost immediately by 2 more, a sequence so sudden that it would have felt like one massive detonation to the men aboard. The explosion did not move gently outward. It drove upward through the crowded decks, striking the very spaces where men had been sleeping, because there had been nowhere else for them to go. The hidden pressure that had travelled inside the Sultana was suddenly released into wood, bodies, steam, and darkness. Decks that had held sleeping men only moments earlier were torn apart from below, changing crowded shelter into broken timber, open air, and sudden death. The blast ripped through the structure above the boilers and destroyed parts of the vessel that had seemed solid only seconds before. Men who had been lying in place were thrown, crushed, burned, or buried in wreckage before they could stand. The upper sections of the boat, already crowded beyond reason, became the first killing ground because they were directly in the path of the explosion's force. A space that had been uncomfortable but survivable became unrecognisable almost instantly. Scalding steam struck with the blast itself, burning and killing before many aboard could even recognise that fire would become the next danger. Boiler explosions were not only blasts of broken metal and shattered wood. They released heat, steam, and pressure with a violence that could destroy the body as quickly as debris. For men waking from exhaustion, there may have been no clear separation between impact, heat, pain, and darkness. The same machinery that had pushed the boat against the Mississippi became the source of injury in every direction. Some passengers died in the first seconds, not from drowning or flames, but from the immediate force and scalding power of the explosion itself. Waking into catastrophe, survivors found themselves surrounded by darkness, wreckage, screams, and a confusion too sudden for the mind to organize. They had not been gathered for battle, and they had not been warned to brace for impact. Many had been asleep, crowded beside strangers, when the boat beneath them changed into a field of broken surfaces. In the first moments after the blast, understanding would have come slowly if it came at all. A man might know only that he was injured, trapped, falling, burned, or unable to find the deck that had been beneath him moments earlier. The disaster did not begin with explanation. It began with shock. Flames followed the rupture through the wooden steamboat feeding on a vessel whose construction made fire as dangerous as the explosion that had begun it. The Sultana was a riverboat of wood, paint, varnish, fuel, and open structural spaces where fire could travel quickly once given a path. The blast had not merely damaged the boat, it had opened it. Broken timber, exposed interior sections, and shattered decks gave flames places to grow. What remained of the vessel was no longer a functioning steamboat carrying men toward home. It was becoming a burning structure on the water, with survivors trying to understand where the danger ended and whether any part of the boat still offered safety. Control disappeared with the damage, leaving the Sultana no longer a working riverboat, but a broken structure drifting through the night. The explosion destroyed the pilot house, removing the organised command and steering that had made the vessel part of river traffic rather than river wreckage. Without normal control, the boat was no longer actively navigating its way north. It was being taken by momentum, current, fire, and damage. The difference mattered because a steamboat under command might still respond to danger. A broken steamboat could only become the setting of danger, carrying men, flames, wreckage, and panic wherever the river allowed it to move. Night made every direction uncertain, because men trying to escape had to read danger through heat, sound, broken spaces, and glimpses of moving water. In daylight, they might have seen paths through wreckage, gaps in railing, or a clearer direction toward the riverbank. In darkness, the world narrowed to immediate sensations: burning wood, collapsing structures, cries from other survivors, smoke, steam, and the cold, black presence of the Mississippi below. Some men were thrown into the river by the blast itself. Others remained aboard trying to move through a vessel that had been split into fire, debris, and confusion. The darkness did not create the disaster, but it made every decision more desperate. Panic met the crowded decks and became another obstacle, as too many bodies tried to move through a vessel already torn open by the blast. The overcrowding that had been visible at Helena now returned in its most terrible form. It was no longer only a warning in a photograph or a number beyond legal capacity. It was a physical barrier to escape. Men were injured, disoriented, and pressed among others who were just as frightened. Broken deck sections blocked movement. Collapsed timbers trapped some where they had fallen. Those who could move had to do so through a space never meant to hold so many people, now made worse by destruction. Some survivors were thrown clear, others were trapped where they had slept, and still others had to decide whether the burning boat or the river offered the smaller chance of death. This was the moment when the disaster divided itself into separate fates. For some, the explosion was final. For others, survival began in the wreckage, with seconds to choose a direction while flames spread and the boat drifted. Remaining aboard meant heat, smoke, collapse, and fire. Leaving the boat meant entering a flooded river at night, injured, weakened, and surrounded by others fighting for the same chance. The explosion had ended the voyage, but it had not yet ended the danger. Broken timber, smoke, steam, and bodies divided the wreck into separate emergencies, with each survivor facing a different version of the same disaster. A man pinned beneath debris faced one kind of terror. A man burned by steam faced another. A man standing at the rail looking down into the Mississippi faced a choice that was hardly a choice at all. The Sultana's destruction was not a single scene, experienced the same way by everyone aboard. It was a series of sudden catastrophes unfolding at once. Above the ruined boilers, along broken decks, near collapsed sections, in smoke-filled spaces, and at the edge where the river waited below. Only after the first violent seconds passed did the next horror become clear. The boat was burning above a river that could kill anyone forced into it. The men who remained conscious had to understand the new shape of their world quickly. The Sultana was no longer carrying them home. It was trapping them between heat and water, between wreckage that could collapse and a current that could take them out of sight. The disaster had moved beyond the explosion itself. It had become a problem of escape, and every possible escape carried its own threat. The boat had become too dangerous to stay on, but the Mississippi offered no promise of mercy. Escaping the wreck now meant entering the Mississippi, where survival would have to be fought in darkness, trapped between fire and the Mississippi. The fight began the instant the river took them, turning escape from the burning wreck into another ordeal their weakened bodies were barely prepared to survive. The explosion had ended the Sultana as a vessel of return, but it had not ended the danger for the men still alive. For some, the blast had thrown them into the Mississippi before they understood what had happened. For others, the choice came seconds later, when fire, smoke, broken decks, and collapsing timber made the river look like the only possible way out. Yet the water below was not rescue. It was another part of the disaster, wide, cold, dark, and moving, with a force that did not care whether a man had survived prison, fire, or the first violence of the blast. Cold water replaced heat so suddenly that men fleeing steam, flame, and broken timber entered a second shock before they could fully understand the first. Their bodies had gone from sleep to explosion, from burning decks to the Mississippi, with no time to prepare for the change. The river in late April was not the soft boundary between danger and safety. It struck injured men with its own force, closing around burned skin, soaked clothing, and exhausted limbs. Those who had been scalded or bruised now had to keep their heads above water. Those who had inhaled smoke or been stunned by the blast had to find breath again. The fire had driven them out, but the river demanded strength many no longer had. Direction vanished in the blackness, leaving survivors to judge the river by sound, impact, current, and the faint outline of the burning vessel behind them. Night turned the Mississippi into a place without clear edges. The shoreline, if visible at all, could appear as a darker shape beyond moving water, while the wreck behind them gave off light that was both useful and terrifying. Men trying to swim or cling to debris had to understand where they were from fragments. The pull of current against the body, the sound of voices nearby, the glow of flames, the movement of broken wood, and the uncertain distance between themselves and anything solid. In daylight, the river might have shown them a path. In darkness, it became a maze. The swollen current scattered the catastrophe across the water, pulling men, debris, and fragments of the steamboat away from the place where the blast had begun. The Sultana had exploded in a river already swollen beyond ordinary conditions, and once men entered it, the disaster no longer stayed gathered around the wreck. The current spread it outward. Survivors who had been sleeping beside one another could be separated within moments. A man who reached a plank might drift away from another who had found nothing. Cries could move downstream with the water until they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The explosion had broken the vessel open, but the Mississippi broke the crowd apart. Floating wreckage became the first uncertain lifeline, offering burned and exhausted survivors something to grip even as the river kept moving beneath them. Pieces of the Sultana, torn loose by the explosion or broken away by fire, became the difference between a man staying above water and disappearing beneath it. A board, a railing, a section of timber, or any floating fragment could become a temporary promise. But wreckage was not steady ground. It rolled, shifted, collided, slipped from numb hands, or carried men farther from the burning boat and farther from any organised help. The same ruined wood that proved the vessel had failed also became the only thing many survivors could hold. Months of captivity returned in the worst possible form because bodies weakened by hunger and disease were now being asked to swim, cling, breathe, and endure. The former prisoners had already spent themselves surviving before they ever reached the river. Their muscles had been reduced by hunger. Their endurance had been worn down by sickness and exposure. Their minds had been shaped by captivity into patience, waiting, and obedience, not sudden struggle in dark water. Now survival required the opposite of waiting. It required action, strength, and resistance against a current that kept moving even when a man's body could not. The disaster punished weakness that the war had already created. Injuries from the blast followed men to the water, making every movement harder for those already burned, stunned, bruised, or struck by falling wreckage. The river did not receive whole men beginning a clean fight for survival. It received men who had been thrown from decks, hit by timber, scalded by steam, cut by debris, or shocked awake into panic. Some may have entered the water unable to swim properly because of wounds. Others may have been too dazed to understand which way to turn. Pain could make the body tighten when it needed to move. Burns could make the cold water feel like another attack. Every injury shortened the time a man could keep fighting. Shore could feel impossibly distant in floodwater, even when land existed somewhere nearby beyond the dark current and the noise of the burning boat. Distance on the Mississippi was deceptive that night. A bank that seemed reachable might still lie across moving water, hidden obstacles, darkness, and the weight of soaked clothing. Men who had not eaten enough, rested enough, or healed enough were being asked to cross a space that healthy swimmers might have feared. Some drifted rather than swam, carried wherever the current took them. Others may have tried to aim towards shapes they could barely see. This shore was no longer simply land. It was an idea pulling at men who might never reach it. Voices carried unevenly across the river, rising from men who could hear one another without knowing who was close enough to reach or already drifting away. The sound of the disaster did not end with the explosion. It continued in calls for help, shouted names, cries from the water, and the crackle of the burning wreck behind them. But sound in darkness can be cruel. A voice might seem near and still be unreachable. A man might call out and receive no answer because the current had already widened the distance. Others could hear suffering around them without having the strength or direction to help. The river carried voices the same way it carried bodies, breaking the crowd into separate pockets of fear. Firelight gave the wreck a terrible visibility, marking the centre of the disaster while reminding survivors why remaining near the boat could still mean death. The burning Sultana was both a beacon and a warning. Its flames could help others see that something catastrophic had happened, and they may have offered survivors a point of orientation in the dark. But the light came from destruction. It came from the place men had fled because the boat could no longer protect them. To drift too close meant heat, smoke, wreckage, and the risk of being pulled back into the ruin. To drift too far meant entering a wider darkness where help might not find them at all. Survival divided itself without fairness, giving some men timber to hold, some a path towards shore, and others only darkness, injury, and water. There was no equal chance after the Sultana exploded. Position mattered, injury mattered. Whether a man had been thrown clear or trapped first mattered. Whether his hands found wood, whether his clothes dragged him down, whether he could keep breathing, whether another survivor crowded the same floating fragment, whether the current carried him toward help or away from it. All of these could decide the outcome before rescue ever arrived. The disaster became brutally uneven, not because some deserved survival more than others, but because the river distributed chance without mercy. Help had to cross more than distance, because the river was still moving, the wreck was still burning, and the men in the water were already losing strength. People on shore and on nearby vessels would begin to understand that something had happened, but knowing there was a disaster was not the same as reaching the men inside it. The survivors were scattered, injured, and drifting in darkness. Some were clinging to wreckage, some were calling out, some were silent because they had no strength left to call. The first minutes in the water had already done what the explosion had not finished. They had turned escape into a race between human endurance and the current. Rescue was beginning to move toward them, but the Mississippi had already started deciding who could wait long enough to be found. The rescue that came too late for most. Rescuers entered a disaster already scattered by current and darkness, where the burning wreck marked only one part of a much wider field of men drifting beyond reach. The Sultana had not failed in a place that could be entered like a room or surrounded like a battlefield. It had broken apart on a swollen river in the early morning dark, with survivors separated by water, wreckage, injury, and distance almost as soon as the explosion threw them into crisis. By the time help began moving toward the scene, the disaster was no longer contained around the boat. It had spread into voices on the current, bodies clinging to fragments of wood, men carried downstream, and a burning shape that could show rescuers where the catastrophe had begun without showing them where every living man had gone. The burning vessel became the first signal that something catastrophic had happened. but flames could not reveal every survivor spread across the water. From a distance, the wreck would have drawn attention because fire on the river at that hour could not be mistaken for anything ordinary. It marked the Sultana as the centre of disaster, and it gave nearby vessels and people along the river a visible point to move toward. Yet the men who needed help were not all gathered beneath that light. Some had been thrown away from the boat by the blast. Others had jumped or fallen into the river and drifted from the wreck almost immediately. The fire showed the wound, but the river had already carried pieces of the wound away. Nearby crews began moving toward the scene with urgency, bringing boats into a river where wreckage, screams and darkness made every approach uncertain. Historical accounts describe the steamer Boston No. 2 reaching the area roughly half an hour after the explosion and rescuing survivors from the water. Other vessels also became part of the response, including steamers and military craft near Memphis. The effort was real, and it was urgent, but urgency did not make the river easier to search. Rescuers were entering a moving field of danger where debris could strike hulls, survivors could disappear between calls for help, and the burning wreck itself remained unstable. Every approach required speed, but every mistake could cost more lives. Downstream near Memphis, the disaster began arriving before anyone fully understood it, carried in the form of exhausted men, broken debris, and voices coming out of the water. Some survivors floated miles from the explosion site toward the Memphis waterfront, where crews aboard docked boats and vessels began to realize that men were passing in the dark. The city had not witnessed the explosion in the way the passengers had. It received the disaster in fragments: a cry from the river, a body clinging to wreckage, a burned man pulled from the water, a current carrying evidence toward the docks before the full story had time to form. Memphis did not need an official message to know that something terrible had happened. The river brought the first proof itself. Searching the river required more than courage, because rescuers had to find individual men in a moving darkness that kept shifting the distance between life and death. A survivor calling out could be near one moment and farther away the next, depending on the current, the angle of a boat, or the strength left in his hands. Lanterns and firelight could reveal pieces of the water, but not the whole disaster field. A man's head above the surface could vanish behind debris or shadow. A floating board might carry someone alive, or it might only be wreckage. The rescuers were not simply moving toward one target. They were trying to locate scattered human lives in a river that kept rearranging the scene. Each rescue depended on seconds, hands, ropes, boats, and the fading strength of men who had already survived explosion, fire, injury, and cold water. Pulling someone from the Mississippi was not a clean or simple act. Survivors could be burned, stunned, too weak to climb, or unable to release the wreckage they had been gripping because that piece of wood had become the only thing between them and drowning. Rescuers had to reach down into the dark, haul men over rails, drag them into boats, and keep searching while others still called from beyond the light. Every survivor pulled aboard was a life saved from the river, but every rescue also took moments that another drifting man might not have. Debris complicated every attempt to help, because the broken pieces saving some survivors also blocked paths, struck bodies, and made the water harder to cross safely. The Sultana's wreckage had become part of the rescue landscape. Boards, railings, fragments of deck, and other pieces of the steamboat moved with the survivors, sometimes keeping them afloat and sometimes making the water more dangerous. Boats had to approach through floating hazards while trying not to run over men hidden among them. A rescuer might see movement and not know whether it was a living person, a log, or a piece of the shattered vessel. The river had filled itself with clues, but not all of them led to someone who could still be saved. Weakness shortened the chance of rescue, especially for former prisoners whose bodies had been reduced by captivity long before the Mississippi demanded one final struggle. Many of the men in the water had already survived hunger, illness, and confinement, and then the blast added burns, bruises, shock, and exhaustion. A stronger passenger might have held to debris longer, or swum farther toward a sound, a light, or a rescuing boat. But many Sultana survivors had been physically diminished before they ever boarded. The time between entering the river and losing strength was not the same for every man. For some, rescue had to come almost immediately, because the war had already taken away the reserves they needed to wait. Current carried some men beyond the reach of voices and lanterns, separating them from the wreck, from rescuers, and from the narrow chance of being pulled aboard alive. The Mississippi did not stop while boats launched, crews shouted, and rescuers searched. It kept moving downstream, taking survivors with it whether they were ready to be carried or not. Some men drifted toward the Memphis waterfront and were found. Others may have moved into darker stretches where no one could hear them clearly. The geography of rescue was cruel because the living did not stay where help first looked. A few yards could matter. A few minutes could decide whether a man became visible or disappeared into the river's wider darkness. Bravery could not reverse the first minutes of the disaster, when explosion, fire, darkness, and water had already taken more lives than any rescue effort could recover. This is what makes the rescue so painful to understand. The people who responded did save lives. Boats moved toward danger. Crews and civilians pulled men from the water. Military vessels and river traffic became part of the emergency response. But courage arrived after the Sultana had already broken apart, after many had been killed instantly, after fire had driven survivors into the river, and after the current had begun scattering them. Rescue could interrupt death for some men. It could not undo the speed with which the disaster had overwhelmed most of them. Survivors who reached boats or shore were no longer only witnesses to the wreck, but the first living evidence of a catastrophe Memphis had barely begun to comprehend. They came out of the river burned, soaked, injured, freezing, and stunned, carrying on their bodies the proof of what had happened upstream. Some had escaped the explosion only to nearly drown. Some had clung to wreckage until hands reached them. Others arrived with stories still broken by shock, able to describe flames, darkness, water, and men disappearing around them before they could explain the disaster in any complete way. Their rescue did not close the event. It opened the next part of it, because every man saved revealed how many others had not come with him. Toward Memphis, every rescued man and every recovered body made the disaster larger than anyone on shore could yet measure. Bodies, hospitals, and the scale of the loss. Memphis received the catastrophe in fragments, through soaked survivors, recovered dead, confused reports, and the first terrible sense that the river had not finished returning what it had taken. The Sultana had exploded upriver, but the disaster did not remain there. It moved toward the city in human pieces. Men pulled from the Mississippi, men carried in with burns and broken limbs, men too shocked to explain what they had survived, and bodies that arrived without the voices needed to identify them. What had begun as a fire in the darkness became something larger on land, where every stretcher and every recovered form made the event harder to misunderstand. Memphis was not only receiving survivors, it was receiving evidence. Within the city, the disaster began changing from distant fire on the water into a human emergency measured in stretchers, wagons, hospital rooms, and names no one could yet confirm. The first accounts could not hold the full size of the loss, because the scene itself was still unfolding. Some men were alive but barely able to speak. Some had been separated from their units, their belongings, and the people who might have recognized them. Some were still in the river or being carried toward the shore. The city had to respond before it could understand. It had to take in the injured, search for the missing, manage the dead, and slowly connect each arrival to the broken steamboat burning upstream. Hospitals faced the living evidence first, as burned, injured, freezing, and exhausted survivors were carried in with wounds that showed how many dangers had struck them at once. These men had not survived one disaster, but several in sequence. The explosion had torn through the decks. Steam had scalded bodies before flames took hold. Fire had driven men into the river. The cold water had punished those already wounded. By the time many reached medical care in Memphis, their injuries carried the whole story of the Sultana in physical form. Doctors and attendants were not treating ordinary riverboat passengers after a small accident. They were facing the aftermath of blast, burn, drowning, exposure, and exhaustion combined. Recently freed prisoners became patients instead of sons returning home, forced from prison camps into another place of pain, waiting, treatment, and uncertainty. This was one of the cruelest turns in the disaster's aftermath. The men had already endured captivity and release, already reached the river that was supposed to return them to their families, and already survived the explosion if they arrived alive in Memphis. Yet home still did not come. For many, the next room after prison was not a kitchen, a farm, or a familiar bed, but a hospital ward. Their journey had moved them from confinement to overcrowding, from overcrowding to fire, from fire to floodwater, and now from floodwater into another place where survival remained uncertain. Accounts from survivors came broken by shock, because darkness, explosion, fire, water, and injury had left many men with only fragments of what they had seen. Some could describe being thrown into the river. Others remembered flames, steam, cries, or the sudden disappearance of the deck beneath them. But the disaster had happened too violently, and in too many places at once for any single survivor to explain it whole. Their memories were pieces from different positions inside the same catastrophe. One man's account began at the blast, another's began in the water, another's began only when hands pulled him from the river. Memphis had to assemble the story from wounded voices before the official record could begin to take shape. Recovered bodies changed the meaning of the disaster with each arrival, turning early uncertainty into a growing recognition that the loss was far larger than anyone first understood. The dead came from the river slowly, not all at once. Some were found near the wreck, others were recovered downstream. Some had drowned after surviving the first explosion, others had been killed before they ever reached the water. Each body made the disaster less abstract and less containable. Early numbers could be revised, corrected, contradicted, or overwhelmed by the next recovery. The river had scattered the dead the same way it had scattered the living, and Memphis had to confront the scale in stages. Identification became its own ordeal, as river water, burns, missing belongings, and scattered records made some victims difficult to name with certainty. The men aboard the Sultana had come from different units and different states, and many had been paroled prisoners still moving through military systems that were already strained by the end of the war. Clothing, papers, personal items, or familiar faces might help identify some, but the disaster had damaged bodies and separated men from anything that could speak for them. A missing man might be dead, unidentified, downstream, hospitalized, or still unreported. In that uncertainty, grief could not always attach itself to a confirmed name, and families far away were left waiting for news that might arrive late, wrong, or not at all. Numbers refused to settle quickly because bodies were found over time, passenger records were imperfect, and the true count had to be pieced together from survivors, missing men, and the dead. The Sultana's death toll has always carried uncertainty, not because the disaster was small, but because it was so chaotic. The boat had been badly overcrowded, records were not clean, and the river did not return everyone in a way that could be counted neatly. Different reports and later studies produced different totals, but all pointed toward the same conclusion. More than 1,000 people had died, making the disaster one of the deadliest in American history. The precise number mattered, but the larger truth was already unavoidable. Burial began before the country fully understood the scale, with many dead first laid to rest near Memphis, before later remembrance fixed the Sultana more firmly into history. The work of death had to proceed even while the numbers remained uncertain. Bodies had to be handled, identified where possible, buried where necessary, and recorded as carefully as the moment allowed. Many of the dead soldiers were buried at Fort Pickering near Memphis, before later reinterment at Memphis National Cemetery, where the disaster would eventually become part of the landscape of national memory. But in the immediate aftermath, burial was not yet history. It was labour, grief, and necessity carried out while the river was still giving back evidence. Rumour could not contain what Memphis was seeing, because the evidence arriving from the river showed a catastrophe too large to remain a confused accident in the dark. The Sultana could no longer be understood only as a steamboat explosion or a terrible river fire. The hospitals, the recovered bodies, the uncertain lists, and the survivors' injuries revealed something broader and more disturbing. This was a disaster built from conditions that had existed before the blast. The overcrowding, the weakened passengers, the dangerous machinery, and the decisions that placed so many lives on one vessel. Memphis was seeing the result, but the result pointed backward. Responsibility slowly emerged behind the grief as the dead, the injured, and the survivors' accounts began pointing back toward the choices that had placed them aboard. Once the scale became clear, sorrow alone could not answer the questions left behind. Why had so many men been loaded onto the Sultana? Why had a damaged boiler not delayed the voyage? Why had the need to move prisoners become tangled with profit and pressure? The bodies and hospital wards did not provide legal answers, but they made the need for answers impossible to avoid. The disaster had become too large to remain only a tragedy. Grief had revealed the size of the loss. But the record now had to confront the men and decisions that made the voyage possible, the investigation that found blame but no justice. Official questions began where mourning could not end, turning the Sultana from a scene of grief into a case built from testimony, records, and unanswered decisions. The dead had already shown the size of the disaster, but the record now had to show how such a voyage had been allowed to happen at all. A boat had been overloaded, a damaged boiler had been repaired quickly, former prisoners had been placed aboard in numbers far beyond safety. Money had surrounded the loading, warnings had appeared before the explosion. The investigation did not have to search for a mystery hidden deep in the river. It had to follow a chain of decisions that had been visible long before the Sultana burned. Investigators faced a disaster with visible causes but tangled responsibility, because the explosion, the overcrowding, and the rushed departure all pointed in different directions at once. Some questions led toward the machinery, where the boilers had failed with catastrophic force. Other questions led toward Vicksburg, where the paroled prisoners had been assigned to the boat. Still others led toward the financial arrangements that made a dangerously full vessel profitable. The deeper the record moved, the less the disaster looked like one isolated failure. It looked instead like several failures arriving together, each one serious enough to matter, none of them carried by only one man. Boiler failure became the most immediate explanation, drawing attention toward pressure, water levels, damaged metal, and the repair that had allowed the boat to continue north. Official findings focused on the conditions inside the boilers and the way the Sultana's movement may have affected water levels while the vessel travelled along the river. A boiler problem had already been known at Vicksburg, and the repair had been accepted because delay threatened the voyage. After the explosion, that earlier decision could no longer be treated as a small inconvenience. It became part of the evidence, a mechanical warning that had been made quiet just long enough for the boat to leave. Overloading remained impossible to separate from the inquiry, since the number of men aboard had changed the vessel's condition before the machinery ever failed. The Sultana had carried far more passengers than it was legally built to hold, and the crowd mattered not only because it increased the number of victims. It changed how the boat moved, how weight rested across the decks, how escape became nearly impossible, and how any emergency would become more deadly. The inquiry could study boilers, but it could not honestly ignore the human load above them. The disaster was not simply that a steamboat exploded, it was that an overloaded steamboat exploded while carrying men who should never have been packed aboard in such numbers. James Cass Mason could no longer defend his choices because the captain who accepted the load and left Vicksburg died with the vessel he had commanded. His absence left a hollow place in the search for accountability. He had known about the boiler repair. He had accepted the paroled prisoners. He had chosen to continue the voyage. Yet after the disaster, he could not be questioned under oath, forced to explain his judgment, or made to answer for what Prophet had done to caution. Blame could be placed on him, but a dead man could not reveal the full arrangement behind him. His death made accountability easier to point toward and harder to complete. Reuben Hatch stood in the background of the record, tied to the prisoner transport arrangements and the accusations that Prophet had helped decide where the men were placed. As quartermaster at Vicksburg, Hatch occupied a position close to the movement of the released prisoners and the steamboat contracts that made their transport valuable. Historical accounts have long associated him with the arrangement that helped send the men to Mason's vessel, and his name became one of the darkest in the aftermath. He represented the kind of official figure who did not stand on the burning decks in the final moments, but whose earlier decisions could shape who ended up there. Missing testimony weakened the search for accountability, especially when important figures avoided the full weight of questioning that might have clarified the loading decisions. Hatch was called to account, but he did not become the public answer the disaster demanded. Accounts describe him ignoring subpoenas and avoiding trial, leaving one of the most controversial men in the story beyond the reach of the punishment that followed. His absence mattered because the Sultana disaster was not only a question of what broke inside the boat, it was also a question of how the boat had been filled, who benefited, and why the system allowed so many soldiers to be placed in one dangerous space. Frederick Speed became the officer most visibly pulled into punishment, as military proceedings tried to attach responsibility to the system that had sent the prisoners aboard. Speed was connected to the parole camp and the movement of released soldiers toward Vicksburg, and his name entered the inquiry as officials searched for someone within the military chain to blame. He was tried and found guilty in connection with overcrowding, which seemed at first like the official record had located responsibility. But even that apparent answer carried uncertainty. The disaster had passed through too many hands for one officer's conviction to feel like the full truth. That punishment did not hold, leaving the official record with findings, accusations, and reversals instead of a consequence equal to the number of dead. Speed's conviction was later overturned, with the reasoning that he had not personally placed the soldiers aboard the Sultana. The reversal left the investigation in a deeply unsatisfying position. It had identified danger. It had exposed negligence. It had followed responsibility toward men and systems involved in the loading. Yet the formal punishment collapsed before it could match the scale of the catastrophe. The record could say that terrible mistakes had been made, but saying so did not bring justice. Responsibility spread across too many hands to land with force, passing through captains, quartermasters, military officers, repair choices, transport orders, and wartime urgency. This diffusion became one of the reasons the Sultana disaster ended so disturbingly. A single villain would have been easier for history to hold. Instead, the story contained overlapping failures: a captain seeking profit, a quartermaster tied to corruption, officers moving prisoners, repair decisions made under pressure, and a military system eager to empty its parole camps. Each part could point toward another. Each answer led to a wider machinery of excuse. The disaster belonged to everyone involved in the chain, and somehow that made punishment belong to almost no one. The inquiry could identify failure without delivering justice, exposing a chain of ignored warnings while allowing the human cost to outgrow the punishment that followed. The dead could be counted, but the accountability could not be made whole. The evidence could show overcrowding, haste, mechanical danger, and official failure, but the law and military process did not produce a consequence strong enough to mark the disaster in public memory. That is why the investigation feels so cold after the fire and river scenes. It did not lack tragedy, it lacked closure. It turned suffering into records, accusations into proceedings, and mass death into a case that ended without a clear reckoning. After the hearings and accusations faded, the Sultana remained less a closed case than an unresolved ledger of men lost, choices questioned, and blame never fully paid. The investigation did not erase the disaster's horror. It deepened it, because it showed that the deaths had not come only from one broken boiler in the dark. They came from a system that had seen warnings and continued anyway. Yet when that system was examined, it bent without breaking. Names appeared, but punishment vanished. Responsibility surfaced, but justice did not hold. America's worst maritime disaster had produced evidence, testimony, grief, and blame, but not the accountability its victims deserved. Accountability dissolved into paperwork, and the disaster began slipping behind the louder events of a nation already overwhelmed by the end of war. The disaster history almost forgot. Memory began failing the Sultana almost immediately, not because the deaths were hidden, but because the nation had already become crowded with grief. The explosion had killed on a scale too large to ignore, yet it happened in a moment when America's attention was already broken by war, assassination, surrender, and uncertainty about what kind of country would emerge from the wreckage. The disaster did not lack horror. It did not lack witnesses, survivors, bodies, photographs, inquiries, or blame. What it lacked was space in the national mind. The men had died at the edge of peace, and somehow that made their deaths easier for the country to lose. April 27th, 1865, placed the explosion inside one of the most overwhelmed weeks in American history, when surrender, assassination, mourning, and pursuit already dominated public attention. Lee had surrendered earlier that month. Lincoln had been shot on April 14th and died the following morning. John Wilkes Booth was killed on April 26th, only one day before the Sultana exploded on the Mississippi. The country had barely absorbed the end of the war before it was forced to absorb the murder of the president who had led it through that war. Into that national shock came another catastrophe, immense in loss but competing with events that seemed to decide the meaning of the entire republic. Newspapers had limited room for another calamity, especially while Lincoln's funeral journey, Booth's death, and the uncertain aftermath of war filled the national record. The Sultana did appear in the press, but it didn't hold the country's attention the way its death toll should have demanded. A disaster on a river could be reported, mourned, and then pushed aside by the next dispatch from Washington, the next detail about the assassination conspiracy, the next question about reconstruction, or the next political fear rising from the war's end. News moved through a country already exhausted by years of casualty lists, and even one of the deadliest maritime disasters in American history became one more terrible report among too many. Returning prisoners made the tragedy painfully human, yet their deaths lacked the single, symbolic focus that allowed other national losses to remain fixed in public memory. These were not famous generals, political leaders, or figures whose names could stand for the whole event. They were mostly ordinary soldiers, many of them recently released from Confederate prison camps, trying to return to families who had already feared they might never come home. Their story was almost too cruel to simplify. They had survived captivity, then died during release. They had endured the war, then disappeared in its aftermath. But history often remembers more easily when tragedy can be attached to one face, one speech, one battlefield, or one decisive moment, and the Sultana's dead were scattered across regiments, states, hospitals, riverbanks, and graves. War exhaustion had changed how Americans absorbed suffering, leaving a country surrounded by casualty lists, prison reports, battlefield grief, and too many fresh graves. By the spring of 1865, death had become a language the nation had been forced to read for 4 years. Families had already lost sons at Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, and countless smaller places that never became famous enough to carry all the pain attached to them. The Sultana added another mass death at the very moment people were desperate to believe the killing was ending. Perhaps that is part of why it slipped away. The disaster contradicted the story the country wanted to tell itself, that survival had finally begun. Failed accountability weakened the story's hold, because no lasting punishment gave the public a clear ending, a clear villain, or a clear reason to keep looking. The investigation produced accusations and findings, but not justice strong enough to anchor the disaster in public memory. Mason had died. Hatch avoided full accountability. Speed's conviction did not stand. Responsibility spread into paperwork, procedure, wartime haste, private profit, and military failure until it became difficult for the public to hold in one place. Without a decisive trial or punishment, the Sultana remained unresolved. It became not only a tragedy, but an unfinished question, and unfinished questions can fade when no institution is forced to answer them. River loss made remembrance harder, with missing bodies, uncertain counts, scattered recoveries, and the Mississippi itself carrying away part of the evidence. Some victims were recovered, some were buried near Memphis and later remembered in National Cemetery records. Others remained part of the river's silence, carried beyond the reach of identification or return. Even the death toll resisted certainty, changing across reports and later studies because the passenger lists were imperfect and the water had not given everyone back. That uncertainty made the disaster feel less fixed than events preserved by battle maps or official rolls. The Mississippi had not only been the setting of the catastrophe, it helped blur its final outline. One photograph survived as a warning, but even that crowded image could not keep the Sultana from fading behind the louder history around it. The Helena photograph still shows the overloaded decks before the explosion, with men packed across the vessel in a way that makes the danger almost impossible to miss. It should have become one of the defining images of the Civil War's end. Released prisoners crowded onto a boat that would soon carry many of them to death. Instead, it became a haunting artifact known more to specialists, descendants, and historians than to the public at large. The image endured, but the national memory around it weakened. Later generations would begin restoring the record through survivor accounts, memorial efforts, historical research, and renewed recognition of the disaster's place in American maritime history. Associations, museums, descendants, local historians, and researchers have worked to keep the Sultana from remaining only a footnote beneath larger events. Their work matters because forgotten disasters do not vanish completely. They wait in archives, cemetery records, newspaper fragments, photographs, and family stories until someone looks again. The Sultana's place in history has become clearer with time, not because the event changed, but because the silence around it has been challenged. Its deepest horror remains the contradiction at the center of the voyage. Men who endured captivity, release, and the end of war were still not delivered safely home. That is why the story continues to disturb long after the river cooled, the inquiries closed, and the country moved into reconstruction. The Sultana was not only a steamboat disaster, it was a final betrayal of men who had already survived too much. Their deaths ask uncomfortable questions about greed, haste, memory, and the way a nation can overlook suffering when history is too crowded with other wounds. The Sultana remains America's forgotten river catastrophe, still asking how so many men could survive the war only to vanish on the journey meant to save them.